We're live. Hello, friends. We'll get started in just a moment. Thank you for being here tonight. We'll get going in just a moment as we wait for the room to fill a bit. Hello. Welcome. I'm Anissa. I am your librarian host tonight, and if you've ever been in a program with me, you know I share a document of the links for tonight's event, which lead back to library events and to our presenters. And I know tonight the resources are going to be flying. I always try to keep up, and this is a live document, so any books, any music, any records, particularly if we can link them back to San Francisco Public, I will add those to our document so you can just pick up that one link and find all of the great things about the library and about tonight's discussion. And I will continue to throw that in as we talk. All right, so thank you all for being here. I'm very grateful to both Justin and Daphne for being here. Justin knows that I've wanted to have Daphne in the virtual library or in person, which that still stands. Whenever you come back to the Bay Area, Daphne, there's a spot in person for you at the San Francisco Public Library.
I hear that.
Yes, so I'm really, really excited that we can make this happen. And this is part of June is Black Music Appreciation Month, if you didn't know that. So this is part of that celebration and part of our gigantic summer stride, which is not just for kids, it's for all ages. And so, you know, if you do your 20 hours reading, going to events like this, or going out and exploring our great city, you too, at the end of 20 hours, will get that iconic San Francisco Public Library tote bag that we give away every summer. Our library does want to acknowledge that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and as uninvited guests, we wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. Right now, I'm going to throw in the chat box some great links to where you can do this interactive map to find out what territory you're occupying at the moment, where you're staying, and a great all-women-led organization out of the East Bay called Segurite Land Trust, and they're working in the land back movement, and they are fierce. So check them out. And just some upcoming events happening are on the same page, which is a bi-monthly read at San Francisco Public, where we encourage you all of San Francisco to read the same book at the same time. This is our May-June selection, Long Live the Tribe of the Fatherless Girls, a memoir. Also fierce, check it out. It's at all the libraries right now. You could walk in and find it on the shelf, many copies available. And T. Kira Madden will be in combo on June 21st with Matthew Clark Davison. We have best-selling author, award-winning Sarah Novick in conversation on Tuesday, June 13th in the virtual library. And Sarah's going to be discussing her book, True Biz, with a Q&A to follow. And this book is really about Sarah on writing and connecting with the deaf community. SFPL has a deaf center, so if that's a service you know that you need or someone you know needs, we have that at our library. We are partnering with the Writers Grotto, the San Francisco Writer Grotto, all summer long. So June, July, and August, we have virtual events lined up. Come check that out. On June 27th, we have Louise Nair and Salia Karist, Searching for Home. And then one last thing I want to tell you all about, because it's going to be so fun and I really want you all to come out. July 15th, out at the new farm, and that's out Tin Cargo Way down by Heron's Head Park in Bayview. And it is a gorgeous place. There's goats, there's chickens, free range, running around. It's like the perfect place for family. You can just let your kids go and like be fine with it. But it's also a great place for all ages. It is a really community gathering. There's going to be music, the bookmobile, free books for all ages. We're going to have a few artists out there doing hands-on arts and crafts and getting creative. 2 bands, including Filipina young ladies rocking out. And we'll have Ashiba doing some Caribbean music as well. So it's going to be a fun day, 12 to 5, July 15th. Don't miss it. All right. And with that, I'm so excited again, like I said, to have the amazing SF royalty in the house, Dr. Daphne Brooks. And Daphne is going to be in conversation today with Justin Desmangles, who is the chairman of the Before Columbus Foundation and the administrator of the American Book Awards, which will be coming soon. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to the both of you. There's going to be time for Q&A. You can start now if you'd like to put it in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we will do those later. Welcome, Daphne Brooks and Justin Desmangles.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Anissa. And again, thanks to the San Francisco Public Library for their continuing support of programs from the Before Columbus Foundation. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Daphne Brooks of Yale University this evening. Daphne, the author of Liner Notes for the Revolution, the Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. Daphne, as a reader of your extraordinary work, I came to it initially from a background not just of a literary scholar, but primarily as a DJ, spending many decades on the radio in San Francisco and Davis, Oakland, Berkeley, Sacramento, and reading the result of prodigious research and bringing with it such illuminating and abundant insight as you do. I must say, it was like coming across an oasis in the midst of a desert and getting a long drink from the fountain of youth, I'll tell you. And part of the reason why it was such an enlivening and continues to be such an effervescent experience to share the work that you've brought our world is the fact that you excavate and revive and resuscitate so deeply within the tradition of the music and the culture that you describe, that you direct our attention to. And I'll just say before opening up the conversation that I think most of us would acknowledge that no music has so thoroughly transformed the social, political, economic, and spiritual spheres of our existence on planet Earth as the great Black music that we know today as blues and jazz and the many names of its children and its godchildren. And so I want to begin our conversation by turning our attentions to that excavation, which you have embarked on with so much, as I said, illumination, prodigious study, but also tremendously charismatic and persuasive prose, very elegant and musical writing style. And this excavation that I'm talking about brings us into the archive of memory and sound. But when we talk about memory and sound in Black music, we're also talking about something that within the context of the United States of America, and indeed the New World, involves a bit of trepidation, since so much of this memory has been deemed off limits, not to be discussed, not to be encroached on. And this is particularly true when it comes to the lives of Black women. So welcoming Daphne Brooks this evening, and beginning there, Daphne, could you share with us some of the challenges and difficulties in plumbing this archive and resuscitating these images, which are so crucial to our inner and outer life?
Well, thank you. First of all, Justin, I want to thank Anissa. I want to thank the San Francisco Public Library for hosting this event, for welcoming me, for championing this book. I would be remiss if I didn't point out the fact that this book is a love letter to the San Francisco Bay Area, to the libraries that fed and nourished me, to my late parents, Nathaniel Hawthorne Brooks, who left this earth 20 years ago, this June 16th, and Juanita Catherine Watson Brooks, who left this earth this past February on the 18th of the month, which is Toni Morrison's birthday. It's a love letter to my older siblings, who created a path of their own in the Bay Area. My sister, who is a beloved icon in Bay Area popular culture and media culture. I say all of this to point out the fact that music is the social fabric of our lives, as you've suggested here, right? And the social fabric of my life was an amalgamation of the music that was bequeathed to me in my family home. And through the kind of journey that I took, falling in love with books and music at the same time. And so that the richness of that world was something that buoyed me up, and also served as the kind of historical memory that I couldn't always get in the classroom. And I was quite lucky to have had great teachers, starting in the San Francisco Bay Area Peninsula in Menlo Park, California, being a proud UC Berkeley alum. The late great Barbara Christian, the first Black woman to ever be tenured at UC Berkeley, pioneer of Black feminist studies. There were a lot of things in my world that allowed me to have access to the kind of the historical prodigiousness of Black life that I wasn't always getting from the institutions around me. So I want to really emphasize that and say how grateful I am to all of that. And I guess, there were so many challenges in writing this book, but I think the one that stays with me, and that I like to talk to my students about at this point, is the style of writing that I decided to pursue in this book, and the importance of trying to get my arms around many different readers who I wanted to be in the room with me. It wasn't going to be an adequate endeavor if I was just writing an academic book for my colleagues at Yale, at Berkeley, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't going to be adequate if I was only writing to the public-facing audiences that I engage with through a variety of different press outlets, Pitchfork, the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. I needed to be able to cultivate a kind of voice that could hold all of those audiences together, and to be able to translate a multiplicity of ideas about Black women's musical genius so that the Rolling Stone reader could understand something about Black feminism, and my Black feminist readers could understand something about rock and roll history and the importance of Black women to rock and roll history. So that was just a piece of it, but that was a challenge for me. And it was a challenge that I really embraced and relished. The archival piece of what I went through with this book was a 12-year journey. And, I think we know enough now in scholarly studies. My wonderful colleague at Columbia, used to teach at UC Berkeley, the great Saidiya Hartman, has shown us so much about what it means to go into archives and to find all sorts of gaps and silences, because we didn't get to build the libraries for ourselves. We were collecting, especially someone like Zora Neale Hurston was collecting, right? But to be able to preserve, our cultural forms, our music, our traditions of storytelling, we had to do that through our vernacular practices. And so when I was entering into archives to try to research more information about Black women musicians in particular, I was faced with having to think counterintuitively often, because you don't always get their voices, right? You get the voices of everyone who is handling them, whether it's through the recording industry or especially through the music critics, who had all sorts of ideas about Black women musicians and who were more often than not, obviously historically, not Black women themselves. So trying to piece together the authenticity and the truth of their experiences and the excellence and quality of their innovations was something that I wanted to think creatively about being able to bear witness to, since their voices were sometimes, not always, but sometimes missing from the historical record.
One of the great harvests that a reader finds with this book, and I think it's conveyed by also the prose style, which you mentioned a few moments ago, which has a buoyancy and a swing, if you like, that lets us in on something that is so critically important to the larger project. And we'll explore this idea further as we go along. And it has to do with the source of will and intention, but commingled and interpolated with the imaginary to set a horizon on freedom that includes not just the sensuous experience of the singer or the songwriter or the composer, but the entire world in which she is occupied. And this has to do with, again, I'll get back to those points, the intention and the will, but as a kind of alchemic design with the imagination to set that horizon on freedom and move. Mm-hmm. So much of this is about, I think when we were talking just the other night, if we were having this in person, we would want to have a dance element mm-hmm. as the culmination of mm-hmm. the whole thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So I want to return to that, about this alchemy of will, intention, and imagination, the mm-hmm. possibility of the practical form of freedom that's being expressed mm-hmm. by the many women that you focus on, mm-hmm. and this oscillation between the inner and outer life, where these artists not only see themselves as individuals, but as a necessary and urgent part of a collective experience that they designate and share in their artworks. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, Daphne?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I so appreciate, the observations that you're making here, Justin. I want to hold on to this idea of, how freedom manifests itself in performance more broadly, but especially in Black radical tradition performance. And that is always rooted in, the adventure of improvisation, right? The ways in which one is able to play through the changes and to navigate, what is the unpredictability of life, and that is, the Black experience, and to be able to lean deeply into a kind of well of invention that can transform, and transfigure according to one's relationship with a broader community, so the concept of the ensemble in jazz music culture, and more broadly in Black music culture, I would argue, and popular music culture, is one in which you are always thinking of yourself, as my friend Fred Moden has put it, as a soloist as opposed to a self, right? A soloist is not a single self, is what we always teach our students, right? If you're a soloist, you are constituted by your relationship with the other players, right, in the ensemble. And so to go to the question that you were asking at the end there, I mean, this is the ways in which the musicians that I'm, really embrace in this book, the ways in which they were building repertoires that were rooted in relationships with other musicians was something that I really wanted to pay attention to and again, to bear witness to.
Hmm.
And, you know, I had grown quite irritated with the ways in which popular music culture had, and popular music criticism in particular, had become invested in this idea of the exceptional and the singular, right? And we know there's all sorts of gendered and problematic ways that women, especially, and women of color performers, have been talked about as divas, and the kind of perversion of that term within the context of capitalist culture as being deeply individual and self-absorbed and narcissistic, et cetera, as opposed to the roots of the term as it relates to, you know, opera virtuoso, right? So that's a whole nother conversation. But I wanted to also to be able to think of these musicians, whether it's Aretha or Beyonce or Zora, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, or Mary Lou Williams or Abby Lincoln, as being connected to a long history of listening to and being invested in a tradition of Black women's musicality that they were carrying forward and bodying forth. You know, they're operating themselves as archives of historical memory. I mean, I've argued this many times now in my work that Beyonce is extraordinary for so many reasons. But one of the things that she's done, because she had the privilege of being able to do it, and I think she would be the first to say that, is to operate as a kind of a conduit of historical memory for all of the Black women performers who came before her. There are many famous performances that she gave in which, you know, she called attention to that, including a moment of silence for Tina Turner, her performance at the Grammys with Tina Turner, which actually upset Aretha because she referred to Tina as queen. But that gets us into a conversation about divas again in more problematic ways. But, you know, I think she is such a powerful example of what the 21st century popular music industry, with you know, all of its problematic socioeconomic and gendered and patriarchal dimensions, it has still created the conditions for someone like a Beyonce to be able to actually take hold of it and to manipulate it in a way that, you know, history is so central to her repertoire, and the history of Black women's musicality is something that she, again, bears witness to in her repertoire. So that's just one example of these the connective tissue that we can imagine these Black women musicians as holding on to in their relationship to other musicians.
And this strategy of looking towards pre-Columbian, pre-European antiquity,
Yes.
into the religious sources of inspiration and revival and resuscitation that have always characterized the great gift of Black music in the New World. And I would emphasize that spirituality, which is still so vibrant in the music today and has been for so long, was never meant to survive in the first place. I mean, the idea that African spirituality would be something of deep wellspring and substance and imagination is a contradiction to the theological proposition of slavery in the first place. And so when you delve into these areas, which you do so elegantly, you help us to understand that. And one of the gifts of this book, in examining those details, which I outlined all too briefly just now, is that you help the reader understand that there indeed is a difference between the recording, which is in fact incidental to the ritual of the music itself. That the music itself and its performance, hey, you know what? This would be happening anyway. We already do this. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. This microphone and the wires, that's okay. But this is actually part of something else. And you really help us understand that so vividly, you know, in response to some of the economic and social violence of the music industry, I would just remind, casual listeners that those are awards for recordings,
Yes.
recordings of music that
Yeah.
actually deny, as you help us understand more fully, the deep wellspring of inspiration and spirituality that actually informs the many rituals which are unfolding in the great Black music. Could we pivot to that a bit? I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on that, about the critical difference between a recording as an archive and the actual music, which is an expression of the culture from which it emanates, and how there's actually contradictions that deserve serious exploration there. Could you talk to us about that?
Well, I think that Zora's work as, well, first of all, she was a polymath. I mean, people know her best as the author of one of the greatest novels of all time, Their Eyes Were Watching God. But she was also a playwright and an anthropologist. She was a musician. She was a multifaceted performer. She was a diasporic historian. She was, sometimes we can think of her as a libertarian. She was a contrarian. She was an outlaw. And I love her to pieces. But one chapter of the book is trying to really pay close attention to her fieldwork recordings that she made in the 1930s, in which she felt that it was very important to capture the sounds of Black sonic life in the South in the early to mid 20th century, because she felt that, Black vernacular practices, as a result of the Great Migration, as a result of industrialization, as a result of ongoing colonization, were in a state of precarity, that they were fading away. This was not an idea that was Zora's solely. She had other Harlem Renaissance brethren like Jean Toomer, who wrote in Cain of the same kind of anxiety of the quickly dissipating forces of Black life, cultural life, that were being affected by so many other external pressures. So the recordings were important, but she always made a point of arguing that they were not, they were in no way going to be able to capture, literally and figuratively, the fullness, the complexity, the multifaceted components of Black performative expression. What she did hope to do, though, was to produce documents, the kids would call it today receipts, for her northern colleagues at Columbia and Barnard, her alma mater, that could really emphasize that there was an entire lexicon of, expression, Black cultural expression, that was deep and contradictory and required great, long-lasting, rigorous study. And this was, of course, to intervene in the fetishization of Black cultural life and Black folk life in the 1920s and 30s, resulting in the rise of the primitivism movement and productions such as Porgy and Bess, which is I'm writing a book right now about Porgy and Bess. So and I will say, I'll go on the record and saying that I believe that Their Eyes Were Watching God was actually a long form rejoinder to Porgy and Bess. It was an interventionist rewrite of Porgy and Bess, but I digress. The point is that the recordings were important to her as interventions in dominant intellectual culture, but she always emphasized that Black expressive life was fugitive, that it could not be held and contained, as you've suggested, by any one tape recording. And that, there are tracks, you can listen to them. If people want to go to the Smithsonian website, you can hear Zora singing making these recordings. And there are songs that she was collecting in the field in which, as she describes them on the recordings to her, anthropological colleagues, this is a song that, has 400 or more authors, and it changes from town to town. It changes from city to city. So for her, it was a matter of being able to contrast the recording with the scale and depth, of Black life. That was kind of, the irony of what she was doing with the recordings was to call attention to everything that was not there.
I think what you're saying is of enormous, monumental importance, and it brings up many different facets of the book and some very long-standing arguments in the West, anyway, about aesthetics and their relationship to ethics, beauty and their relationship to morality,
Yep.
and very pointedly orality and its relationship to literacy.
Mm-hmm.
Literacy, of course, being something like a recording that is fixed. One is capable of pausing, playing back, turning up, turning down. Mm-hmm. Whereas orality and the methods of orality that are strategized and performed allow, getting to the point that you were making about Zora, for a more supple and pliant interpretation of what is perhaps the same story or the same song, perhaps ancient in its wisdom and characteristics, but within the Black American culture throughout the diaspora of the hemisphere, can be used then, as she shows us and as you have in this work, to address the immediate circumstances, the immediate material and spiritual circumstances of the singer, the song, and the environment that they're in. Why? Because it's not fixed. Because it is oral. Yes. It has this capacity for illuminating the present moment in a way that a recording or a let's call it a literate text could never actually do. And this contrasts not just different ways of knowing and transmitting knowledge, but more largely linear versus nonlinear organizations of time and space. So could you talk to us a little bit about that? Now, you've written quite a bit about it in the book, but I think this is an important point to amplify, because you mentioned Barbara Christian, and she addresses this as well, about how, because of this supple, pliable, buoyant, welcoming nature of orality as a way of expressing knowledge and ways of knowing, there's a lot of barriers that are immediately broken down to inner histories and personal histories with Black women that would otherwise be sequestered or suppressed. So could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Could you say a little bit more, Justin, about what do you think about in the book? I'm curious that brings you to that.
Oh, okay. Well, let me get to this particular quote from Barbara Christian. Our beloved Barbara Christian.
Our beloved from
Gone but not forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. Okay, so I'll read directly from your text here. And this is in commentary about the great composer and pianist Mary Lou Williams. To call her a theorist, then, is to be reminded of Barbara Christian's revolutionary claim at the height of the 1980s academic canon wars that, quote, people of color have always theorized, but in forms quite different from the Western form of abstract logic. She continues, and I am inclined to say that our theorizing, and I intentionally use the verb rather than the noun, is often in narrative forms, in the stories we create, in riddles and proverbs, in the play with language, because dynamic rather than fixed ideas seemed more to our liking. How else have we managed to survive with such spiritedness the assault on our bodies, social institutions, countries, our very humanity?
Yes.
So it seems to me, again, here you're helping your reader understand how these modes of expression and ways of knowledge that come through the culture and the music are unique to the form itself, and otherwise wouldn't get through.
Well, that's Barbara too.
Yeah.
I mean, that really is Barbara.
Yeah.
I mean, I found her extremely famous essay. That's an excerpt from The Race from Theory for Theory, incredibly crucial to the claims that I wanted to make about these performers. And in the case of Mary Lou Williams, an example of an artist who was producing theory about Black life through her music. And this is always the case. This is an argument I think many of us who are Black music critics would make, is that, the music supplies theories and philosophies about Black life, in the making. And, when it comes to Mary Lou Williams with a song like Nightlife, which I write about in the book, she's giving you an entire sermon on, the meaning of time in relation to, Black sociality, right? How to navigate time, how to navigate an entire evening, right? This is an instrumentalist, one of the greatest composers and jazz pianist of all time, if not the greatest, right? And her compositions and her performances offered us concepts and ideas and opinions about what it meant to live a Black life in the middle of the 20th century. And she really stretched across, all the major genres of jazz, across the 20th century in her long career. But, each of those performances, one can extrapolate Mary Lou Williams' observations about, a whole constellation of experiences in relation to African America, right? So I wanted to be able to really emphasize that and use her as an example of this thing that, that permeates the Black music tradition across the board.
It's a boldness and a rare courage and tremendous authority of feeling throughout all of Mary Lou Williams' repertoire and her work. And I want to emphasize and underline a point that you're making to help those in the audience who may not quite be familiar with who Mary Lou Williams is. You're in for some big, beautiful surprises when you find out. But that is to say how radical and revolutionary it was in its time for a woman to come forward and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to play my music, my compositions, and my arrangements, and I will be the leader. I'm not going to necessarily adopt passively the repertoire of what is considered popular music. I'll create my own.
Yes.
And this, again, in its time, and I think to many degrees still today, was a decisively radical break.
Yes.
In terms of the culture and how music and cultural production was perceived. Mary Lou Williams really was kind of the exemplar in that regard, which led or opened towards other grand figures like Abby Lincoln. I think.
But Mary Lou Williams also, she mentored generations of jazz greats.
Including
they all
Monk.
look to her. There are some famous photographs of Monk and Dizzy Gillespie and, Duke Ellington all sitting around her, right? And really, again, kind of absorbing the pedagogy, of her musical philosophies as manifest in her sounds and performances, that pedagogy and that, again, that critical listening, the ability for musicians to build on the lessons of other musicians and the historical memory of other musicians, and especially in the case of Black women musicians, the ways that they, absorbed the models that were set for them, and then pulled that tradition forward, is something that I really wanted to get down on the record. Something that, I think has been taken for granted in popular music history for a long time.
I think so. Earlier in the conversation, you were just talking about the role of the soloist as being an expression. Not exactly. And some of the more contemporary misuses of the word diva and the designation of the individual who does it all on their own.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hold some of our thoughts that we've brought about concerning Mary Lou Williams and her radical turn and wave forward with what she helped to guide the music and other Black women artists towards by thinking about Abby Lincoln and thinking about her in terms of someone who not only infused her own spiritual biography into her art and shared it with the world, but also both in her music and visually kind of traced that entire arc of the individual so-called diva to a person who is deeply concerned with the collective and aligning their individual expression as part of that historical experience. And I'll bring up a couple of images sort of as a chronology here that you're familiar with. Here's the famous cover of Ebony magazine from 1957.
Wearing a very famous dress.
Wearing Marilyn Monroe's dress.
Yeah. Which she performed in that dress in the film with Little Richard, The Girl Can't Help It. Very famous, and really kind of marked Abby Lincoln early on in her career as being a sex symbol in the genre of someone like Dorothy Dandridge.
And this is from, let's see, 1957. So it's really actually just slightly before her career on records begins. She had already taken this trajectory.
Yep.
And she continues with that for a little while, doesn't she? Here's the album Affair, a beautiful recording on Liberty. She's continuing to explore and play with that image on her first album for Riverside. And then getting back to the point, we start to see the turn, which I think really begins with Abby is Blue, where she very consciously adopts the themes of what is being faced in Black life with enormous rigor and courage. Yeah. Including a work from Langston Hughes. And,
that's right.
Also from Cry the Beloved Country.
Yep.
And beginning collaborations with Oscar Brown Jr. And then we see the Abby that we start to know from Straight Ahead.
Straight Ahead.
Which has still got to be one of the most advanced, aesthetically, ethically, morally. And you've written about this in Blue Monk, which I hope her lyrics for Blue Monk we'll talk about in a minute. But very quickly here, moving along, we see now she is truly coming out. Amanata Moseka, People in Me. And then, lo and behold.
Wow.
There she is. And continuing with the strength of the natural beauty of her womanhood. So Abby Lincoln is somebody that I think really amplifies so many of the salient points in your book. Could you share with us some of your thoughts as we look at these images and think about the connection with Mary Lou Williams and that radical gesture that Abby so valiantly brings to us in our moment today?
Well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind about the connection between Abby Lincoln and Mary Lou Williams, and one sees this in their archives, which you can find at the Institute for Jazz Studies at Rutgers University out here on the East Coast in New Jersey. Their archives are incredibly rich in detailing the extent to which they really embrace the role of being cultural historians. and griots for the Black community. They really, really, took extensive notes, and in the case of Mary Lou Williams and actually Abby Lincoln as well. This isn't in the book, but you can find this in the archives. You can find a Mary Lou Williams illustration in the book. I won't pull it out right now, but they each, mapped out these sort of visual ideas, drawings, and, as well as poetry and, critical notes about Black history that they wanted to be able to interpolate into their music. So they took it really seriously, the idea of, being a Black historian, being an intellectual for the community, and melding that together with their innate sense of musicality and improvisatory experimentation. So they were very similar in that way. And with Abby Lincoln, she even went a step further. Mary Lou Williams did this in unpublished notes, but Abby Lincoln was giving lectures at the New School and on Black feminisms, and she was writing articles that appeared in Jet, and she was writing letters to the editor, to various jazz critics, including Nat Hintoff, and she got into dust-ups with Irving Goffman and others. So she really, I always like to believe that this was always the Abby Lincoln, that was even in the red dress, right? It was just about being able to find the platforms and the aesthetics and a broad enough repertoire that could encompass all of that,
Yeah.
And she was able to do that. And of course, her, legendary partnership with her husband for a significant stretch of time, Max Roach, was a powerful way in which she was able to kind of take all of these passions about literature and history and art and music and funnel them into Black freedom struggle sounds. So, I will talk about Beyonce all night. This is maybe something, Justin, you didn't want to, but I think Beyonce is an example of what Abby Lincoln was doing in the 60s, because, we could map if I had all her albums out, we could map the evolution of Beyonce, including the pivot after the Harry Belafonte dust up, which I'm not going to suggest that he was the reason for this, but I think the timing was very interesting, that his critique of the both of them, of Jay-Z and Beyonce, came right before Beyonce delivered to us, a series of just, potent and unprecedented, socio-political activist statements about Black feminisms and about Black life. And it started with Black feminisms. I think that's really important. She comes out as a feminist and then embraces Black Lives Matter. So I think there's some very interesting resonances between Abby Lincoln and Beyonce, just in case there might be any young people who happen to listen to this conversation, that's worth holding on to.
And indeed, doing sort of a TikTok backwards, we could find some of the origins with Mary Lou Williams and Abby Lincoln going back centuries, even before musical recording, with this very expansive presence that, like Beyonce, as you mentioned, like Abby Lincoln and Mary Lou Williams, where the woman artist has a social, political, economic, and spiritual role, both as a performer and musician, but also as archivist, as interpreter.
Yep.
Of the inner qualifications of the actual compositions themselves, changing over time. This is something I think is really key, and we haven't had a moment yet to drop in on it. So maybe now is a good time. It has to do with improvisation, which we touched on a little bit. And you mentioned Porgy and Bess. I'm excited to see that work when it comes out.
Yeah.
But where I'm going with that is the this tremendous body of song, say from 1900 to 1950. We'll just call it American popular song.
Yeah.
Which largely, I believe, it's fair to say, survives because of its interpretation in jazz.
Oh, sure.
In other words, were it not for,
Yeah.
okay, so where I'm going with that is
Yeah.
how the soloist or the improviser from within the composition takes on an interpretive stance.
Sure.
In which they reveal corners and details, magnify certain elements, shadow others as a way of interpreting the work and bringing it into the present time. It's one of the most miraculous and explosive aspects of jazz, from its origins right up into free jazz, right up in and now. Could you offer a little commentary on that? Because it's one of the features of the great Black music that we see as a common thread that weaves together the entire vision.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the gendered obstacles in being able to really come to terms with the importance of improvisation as it relates to our great vocalists is that, vocal performances were marginalized at the expense of a kind of hierarchical investment in the instrumentalist, and the presumption that vocalists aren't instrumentalists as well. So, being able to understand the ways that Ella Fitzgerald, in interpreting the American Songbook, is not only offering, some of our most astonishing examples of the ways in which masterful improvisation works in popular music culture, but she is giving us an example of what it means to arrange in action. And that's something that the French theorist Peter Zendy has written about, and I admire his work a great deal. He talks about arrangers as being listeners, right? And then an arrangement is a listening, right? And to the extent that we can kind of understand vocalists who are, improvising and finding new and enlivening interpretive ways of handling the object that is the song, you are getting a live form, arrangement and arrangement and rearrangement of the material in question. And it's one of the things that in feminist sound studies we've had to really fight to put at the center of our studies, is to take seriously what vocalists are doing. Somebody like Nancy Wilson, who's a song stylist, that's an enormously challenging and invigorating and sui generis and unique kind of role to play in the context of ensemble work. The Nancy Wilson of our generation, Cécile McLorin Salvant, who I write about in the book, does unbelievable things like I had never seen before with performing Jelly Roll Morton's Murder Ballad, which is, a 40-minute song. And what she's able to do with that 40 minutes of folk material, in jazz at Lincoln Center. I've never experienced anything like that before. That's radical arrangement in action.
And speaking about those radical arrangers who are also performers and interpreters, archivists, historians of their own, I think, of course, of people like Betty Carter.
Yes.
Whose sense of drama in terms of theatrical proportion and timing is just astounding. Or you think of someone like Carmen McRae.
Yes.
Who just as a stylist, she's got a whole dramatis personae all on her own.
Yes, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Just like,
or in the popular context, Aretha, Patti LaBelle, Chaka Khan.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. And getting back to a point that I made, earlier, it must be underlined. I mean, we're talking about a music that has affected in a positive way, in a fertile, fecund, and welcoming way, every corner of the planet. There's
Yes.
nowhere on earth that hasn't been touched fertily and,
Yes.
and kindly and, and warmly and welcomingly by the great Black music and the women who created it. You know, so now we're getting towards the top of the hour, Daphne, and I want to thank you again for being really generous with us. You know,
Absolutely.
it's beautiful to have you here.
Having me.
I know there's people who have questions for you. So as in a moment, I'll defer to Anissa, and we can start opening that up, because I know there's folks that are excited that you're here. But before we turn to the Q&A, I just want to get a little more from you on the book and the magnificent Rosetta Records and Rosetta Reitz.
Right.
And
That's right.
who came into my life as a teenager.
Yes.
With this incredible collection of Lil Green. And for folks who aren't familiar with Rosetta Records, I have a few of them. This is a feminist run, executed, educated, and otherwise amplified label. There's the great Ethel Waters there. Here's some real business that you can bank on. Sorry, but I can't take you. Women's Railroad Blues. And to give you an idea of how thoughtful and valuable to the study of this music, you'll see as Daphne teaches us in her book that Rosetta Reitz offered deep scholarship with all her records. These notes are an education in themselves, and you devote some considerable space in liner notes for the revolution for Rosetta Records and Rosetta Reitz. Could you share with us some of how that came to you and why it was so important to include in your book?
Well, I really, again, am indebted to my mentors. So Hazel Carby, the great Black feminist scholar at Yale, had told me about the Rosetta Records that she had purchased when she was teaching blues women's music courses at Yale in the late 80s and early 90s. And when I joined her as a colleague on the faculty at Yale and started teaching Black women in popular music culture there, she said, you know, you should really take a look at these records. And that was how it happened for me. We're so lucky that Professor Carby had those albums, the ones that you're holding up, and there were about a little more than 3 dozen that Rosetta Reitz put out on her own label. And Professor Carby was able to have Yale purchase almost all of them for our collection. So I've used them in the classroom, but, you know, I became drawn to Rosetta Reitz's story. She actually passed away in fall of 2008, just as I was finishing teaching the class. And her story was really, you know, quite riveting and moving. She was Jewish New Yorker, white Jewish New Yorker, second wave feminist. She was writing a book about menopause, as she liked to always tell it, in the late 70s, and started listening to Bessie Smith and some of the other classic blues queens, but then quickly discovered that most of their recordings were out of print. And she took it upon herself with her divorce money to start her own independent record label, Rosetta Records. She went beyond that, though. She wrote the liner notes, so the essays, the critical essays that accompany the recordings on the sleeves, i.e., the lining of the records, the LPs. She wrote essays that were really pointedly trying to recuperate the deep centrality of Black women musicians, as we've been discussing all night, to the foundations of not just American popular music culture, but American culture in general. So she was really pulling together feminist theory of the 1970s and 80s with her politics and her musical sensibilities, and writing these just, you know, really beautiful essays. Essays that could go toe to toe with any of our, you know, greatest jazz music critics who, you know, so often, you know, once again, men, Leonard Feather, Nat Hentoff, but also, you know, she's writing in one of the great rock music criticism of the 70s and 80s. And I wanted to be able to bring her into the conversation of her understanding of what the intellectual history of Black women's music is. She went beyond the essays, though. She became a public historian. She would mount these concerts in which she was able to gather together some of the sisters who were still alive, you know, Coco Taylor, Sippy Wallace, you know, they were, you know, coming into their deep into their golden years, but she was able to bring them onto the stage at Symphony Hall and other venues in New York City in the 1980s, and to bring that music to life. And she's really, for me, just a superhero model of the kind of work that I do. And I wanted to make sure that we could think about the critics who were looking after these musicians in my book, as well as the musicians themselves. That's the broader history of Black feminist sound that I was trying to present in a way that, you know, could allow us to reevaluate how we think about popular music history altogether.
And I think I speak for many of us when I say we're deeply grateful to you for the extraordinary work that you've accomplished and brought our world. I do want to bring it back to Anissa, because I'm sure there's some questions out there. Anissa, are you there in the?
I am here. I am here. We have a question from Annie. They say it's interesting about the archives, and this was pretty in the start of your conversation. Do you see a change in how archives are handling Black history and culture, similar to the queering of the archive movement?
That's a great question. Thank you, Annie. I think we are seeing some changes. And I think some of the things I'm excited about are the ways that archivists are collaborating with academics and musicians in order to think about how we can you know, manage the silences, as we were talking about earlier, through creative means. We're doing that at Yale. I co-founded a working group with my colleague, Brian Kane, also a Cal alum, called Black Sound in the Archive. And that is a working group in which we conduct workshops in conjunction with our rare book and manuscript library. And we look at the song lyrics of Langston Hughes, and we look at the different performances of Summertime, and we think about and try to piece together the ways in which those recordings and performances resonated in the time in which they emerged, but also how we handle them in our present time. So that's something we do with the students, but we also bring musicians in. We've had everybody from the aforementioned Cécile McLorin Salvant to Rhiannon Giddens. Early on, I did a very large program with Jack White, who's a very interesting blues archivist, in addition to being this great, rock and roll musician, knows a lot about Ethel Waters, which would shock you. He was actually one of his record label, Third Man Records, helped to reissue the Paramount Records entire catalogs, which is one of the biggest and largest race records catalogs in American history. So we brought these folks in, Jason Moran, the great jazz pianist, and we asked them to talk about how they handle our archives, how they manage archives, how they bring the archives back to life through their own musical repertoires. And it's my understanding, both talking with librarians at the New York Public Library, where I'm in residence this year, as well as my colleagues at Yale and elsewhere, that there really is a hope that we'll be able to do more of this kind of programming that brings the archives to the public, and that, revivifies them through the ways in which musicians of today manage them and care for them and look after them. So thank you, Annie, for that question.
Thank you, Daphne. I love it. There is also a question. Thank you for the lecture. Looking forward to reading the book. Are there any Black women in hip hop rap artists that you would consider as cultural historians?
That's such a great, I have not gotten that question. I've been on a book tour for a couple of years now. Oh, man. Well, I mean, first woman hip hop musician to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, although that's a shame, but it's not that she's being inducted, but that she's the first. Missy Elliott, I think, is a great historian. She's also an Afrofuturist in many ways, in the ways that she has, used the archive, used her kind of masterful and really surprising and whimsical, excellence in sampling to get us to kind of rethink hip hop history, especially in those early Missy Elliott recordings. Absolutely amazing. Somebody like Jean Grey is someone, working on a street level kind of engagement with the history of Black urban life. Absolutely extraordinary. I think that there are inventive experimentalists, somebody like Azalea Banks, who I think is very polarizing figure, has done some interesting things with kind of taking fragments of popular music culture and suturing them together in order to create these kinds of fugitive representations of Blackness. So one could also argue that, all of our great hip hop artists are archivists and historians, right? Because you're working with all of these different postmodern fragments of sound and culture and piecing them together into something new. But that's really great. I definitely, I think Missy is the artist who comes to mind as being, the most electrifying still for me in many ways. Thank you.
I'm checking YouTube right now. A YouTube viewer says they missed the liner notes very much.
Yes, thank you. That I agree. I'm right there with you. Somebody who's trying to bring the form back, and I write about her in the book, is Janelle Monae and her Wonderland Collective. Collaborators Nate Wonder and Chuck Lightning, who, fun fact, went to Morehouse and were Black Studies and philosophy majors. They once came to my class at Princeton, where I used to teach before Yale, and I said, do you want to have a conversation like what Justin and I are doing tonight? And they said, no, thanks. We're going to do a lecture. We have a PowerPoint. We're going to start by talking about Jean-Paul Sartre and move to W.E.B. Du Bois. And that, in a nutshell, is how you get Janelle Monae in many ways. But yes, they've written really just exhilarating and surprising and counterintuitive liner notes for her early recordings, right through her last recording. And I don't, she's got a new album coming out soon. We'll see what she does with this latest
She
release.
is amazing. She also has a book called The Librarian. I mean,
that's right.
She is just, I am
That's
mind
right.
blown by everything they do. Also,
yeah, that's right.
Gender fluid. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I believe Janelle Monae will be someone that we will know quite in our future for a very long time. Someone asked, are you familiar with More Mother, and what do you think?
Oh, my God, yes. We tried to get her to come to an event that I organized last fall. We did get the great Diane Reeves to come, so that was great. This was a conference in honor of another extremely important Black feminist scholar, mentor to me, Farah Jasmine Griffin, jazz studies great, who teaches at Columbia, wrote one of the most important books about Billie Holiday, and she's from Philadelphia. And so we had a session. It takes too long to explain this, but the session is called Critical Karaoke. It's something we've been doing for the past 20 years at the Museum of Popular Music Culture's annual music conference in Seattle. And this Critical Karaoke was in honor of Philadelphia. And so we did ask More Mother to come. She couldn't make it, now teaching at USC, which is really exciting. But to get to the heart of your question, I think she's extraordinary. I think her work creates these overwhelming sonic palettes that are, world altering. She does things with sound and with atmosphere that are deeply sensorial and radically sensorial. She's extraordinary. So thank you for bringing up More Mother. Everyone should listen to More Mother.
And last call for questions, friends. This is it. YouTube checking. We're good. I think we're good on questions.
I have one last question.
Of course, Justin does. I knew it.
We were speaking moments ago about interpretive technique from within the song. And many times artists, some of whom you write about, many times women in jazz interpret a song in a way that becomes the definitive version of this, in sometimes a radical and unexpected ways. I'm thinking now of Nina Simone's Pirate Jenny.
Yes.
Completely transforms Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill's
it's an
tableau into
inspiration
something
in her hands.
Can you, Daphne, can you think of any other examples of specifically that, where the radical interpretation by a Black woman artist evolved to become the interpretation of the work, which I think is fair to say about Nina's live recording of Pirate Jenny? I believe so. Are there any other examples of that come to your mind? I know that's kind of a big question to end on, but
I mean, I couldn't settle on one, but today I heard Gladys Knight and the Pips cover of Yesterday, and I wish it were the definitive version. I'll say that. It changes the entire tonal register of that song. It's incredible. But I mean, come on. I mean, Aretha's, Otis said, she took my song. It's not my song anymore. It ain't my song anymore. Respect. I mean, I think the really exciting thing is to be able to find these performances and recordings that are doing this kind of work just day in and day out. I mean, Nina did that all of the time, just because it's on my mind right now, but also because it's just extraordinary. It's Nina's cover of Summertime from her hall performance. She rewrites the opera. She turns what is really, a black-faced misogynist, folk ersatz, anti-Black, folk caricature performance. She turns it into, this cataclysmic kind of meditation on Black intimacy, between two characters who were, constructed, as a cartoonish imaginings of, white occupiers of Black sound. She goes to the heart of that material and turns it inside out. So.
Well, I am, this has really been a dream come true, Daphne. Thank you for making this happen. And Anissa, again, it is always such a pleasure to work together with San Francisco Public Library. I will remind our audiences, if you enjoyed this kind of programming, I urge you to also support the Before Columbus Foundation and our American Book Awards program. You can find us online at beforecolumbusfoundation.com, where I encourage you to donate generously for more programming like this. And of course, the Book Award program, which honored Professor Brooks just last year for liner notes for the revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. Read the book and become that thing. Let it happen. And next time we'll get a dance floor part of this.
There we go.
Next time you're in the city, we can like turn the whole atrium into the library, into a dance floor. We've done it before.
I'll be out there the second half of summer. So
get the turntables, Get the
Let's do it.
records.
Let's do it. And again, yes, this has been I've been talking to Justin about having you, so I too am a big fangirl. I appreciate you being here tonight. And library community, I told you those resources would be flying with these two. So here's the link for tonight's document. And also a big fan of your sister, of course, Ronelle Brooks.
Yes.
Ronelle in the morning when I moved to San Francisco, she had just joined KML, and I can't even. So amazing.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, Anissa,
No, no.
but I will say I've done, maybe 36 book events over the past couple of years for this book. And I've always told the story of how my sister both, created the conditions for me to fall in love with popular music culture, but also being a proud alum of Mills College. She brought home all the Black feminist literature that was unfolding in the revolution of the 70s and 80s to me. And that combination is how I exist today. So I'm grateful to her.
Thank you both. And I mean it again. Email me when you come. We will book
Okay.
you. We will have a dance
Make it
party.
happen.
It's on.
All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, library community. We'll
Thank
see
you so
next
much.
time. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you,
Anissa.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Anissa.
Justin. Thank